They inhabit our nightmares.
Best villains don't know they're villains. Best villain thinks he's a hero.
They enliven our myths.
If you're a Jungian psychologist, you say that we have a shadow side, a part of ourselves that we are not willing to acknowledge, that we project our negative traits onto.
They are the archetypes that embody the dark side of the human condition.
You only identify with a hero as long as the hero is struggling against something you have also struggled with.
Every time we see a great battle between a hero and a villain, we have to look at it almost like we're afraid, and we're just hoping that we're more like the hero than the villain. And I think that's what makes like a great story, when both sides represent almost an aspect of ourselves.
They are the villains of the Legion of Doom.
Back in the 30s and 40s, when superheroes were created, a good villain was just a guy who robbed the bank, or held a town hostage. This is not something that has a lot of moral gray area to it.
The line between hero and villain was very clear. It was white hats and black hats.
You wrote a story, there was a good guy, there was a bad guy, the good guy beat the bad guy, and you tried to get as many exciting pictures and illustrations as you could.
In the early years of comic books, villains were not fantastical aliens or superpowered world conquerors. The evildoers of the Golden Age were Depression-era gangsters, bandits, corrupt politicians, and slumlords.
They had a lot of superheroes, but they didn't really have a lot of supervillains. Supervillains were kind of an unusual concept back in the 40s. Batman was really the only hero who had like a really extremely entertaining rogues gallery. Superman mostly just fought guys like Lex Luthor who were mostly just like, they looked like businessmen, but they were mad scientists.
That changed just before World War II to more of the world-controlling characters. There were more villains who were sort of doppelgangers of Hitler and Hirohito. From that point on, we actually started to get supervillains, so they became characters that had powers and they were stronger than the heroes, but very few of them were about anything.
In the early comics, a guy would call himself a supervillain, and the fact that he called himself that was what you needed to know about it.
The problem that the superheroes have faced over the past 60 years or so is that basically their methodology can't change much with the times. They're still champions of truth and justice. They can't go to extremes, but the villains have to get smarter and craftier and more aggressive as the years go on, and suddenly robbing a bank is not enough.
We have loaded down all of our fears of what can go wrong in the human heart onto the villain.
Over time, it became a cat and mouse type of story. By the time Julie Schwartz was doing The Flash and Green Lantern, the villains were challenging the heroes more for enjoyment. They would specifically go out of their way to make themselves known for that. In Green Lantern, they became more cosmic because he was the first of the space heroes.
In one sense, you could look at all of the old superheroes that we have been reading about and animating since the 1920s and 30s as characters who all have a nemesis.
By 1960, when the superhero group, the Justice Society, was relaunched as the Justice League, comic book villains had changed, reflecting America's newfound fascination with the space race and science fiction.
In the very first Justice League story, they fought this, it sounds kind of silly, but it was this alien super starfish named Starro, who actually could control people's minds and was trying to conquer the planet.
Since Superman and Batman weren't around, there were 5 heroes that were there. So the cover is these 5 superheroes, each fighting a different tentacle of this giant starfish.
A lot of the villains that were created in the early 60s never came back, and for good reason. They were good one-time visual ideas.
Though it may appear that villains are simply concocted over the drawing table or the typewriter, rather arbitrarily, if you look at the pattern of the relationship between heroes and villains throughout history, from the modern myths and fairy tales up through modern literature, we see that the hero gets the villain he deserves.
In the 1970s, the animated show The Super Friends introduced a group of supervillains powerful enough to challenge the Justice League of America. This conglomeration of villainy became known as the Legion of Doom.
What I find first compelling about the Legion of Doom is the word itself. Doom goes way back to the old Anglo-Saxons, and it originally meant law and judgment. So the Legion of Doom already gives you this sense of revenge. These are 13 characters who are out to wreak revenge, out of resentment, out of bitterness, out of jealousy. Usually that the heroes are getting all the attention, and they're not.
The strongest villain in this calamitous collection is Bizarro, spawned as a result of Superman's exposure to a duplicating ray.
In Bizarro's case, we have this attempt to replicate Superman. If we can't defeat him, we'll clone him. Mythologically, what you've got then is the twin. Bizarro goes berserk because he can look like Superman, but he doesn't have the compassion.
What's so great about Bizarro is that he's Superman's opposite and has to be Superman's opposite. So he doesn't have any freedom.
I don't think of him as a villain. I know he's come back into comics more as a villain. I saw him as a misunderstood Frankenstein creature.
One of the things they did at DC for a while in the late 60s or mid-60s was Tales of the Bizarro World, which was essentially a comedy strip. Everything in the Bizarro world was just square.
Visually, the Bizarros are pretty cool because we get to see a Bizarro Superman and a Bizarro every character in the DCU. And they have these chiseled white skin. Everything's a little off. The S is off, the hair's messed up.
When there's one of them, when there's a Bizarro, when you're dealing with a creature who thinks so diametrically opposite to you that you cannot predict what he will do next, and when he's as strong as Superman, you've got something that's threatening and dangerous.
The second member of the Legion of Doom is the underwater pirate Black Manta. Armed with blaster rays inside his subaquatic helmet, he is a ruthless strategist and Aquaman's arch enemy.
For me, the mythic counterpoint to the Black Manta character is Poseidon. The Black Manta is perennially trying to find a treasure in the bottom of the sea.
In the classic storyline, he's the one who killed Aquaman's son. That makes him a character of power because of what he did.
A villain worthy of bringing back a lot. For a villain who frankly doesn't have a terrific costume. It's basically a black jumpsuit with a mushroom on his head for a mask.
But Black Manta has his place in comics history because he took off his helmet for the first time and we realized he was a man of color underneath the helmet. Black Manta was not simply the color of his costume, but a statement of his race.
One of the most compelling characters in the Legion of Doom pantheon is the world-conquering android, Brainiac.
Brainiac is an intriguing character because the truth of the terror behind his image is right in the word. It's a combination of brain and maniac. And it's reflected a long, long suspicion of living too much in our head.
He was a robot. There wasn't any fake, gee, I look like a human being, but I've got green skin. He was something that was a machine, which is what Brainiac is at the heart of it.
In many ways, he's a mirror for Superman. But where Superman comes to Earth and then lives here amongst us and, you know, even though he's not, calls us his equals and puts our concerns above his own, Brainiac just comes here and we're just fodder to him.
Everything to him is just a matter of logic, and without one bit of emotion thrown into it, which makes him very cold because he doesn't care.
When small-time criminal Leonard Snart donned a blue parka, glasses, and a Colt gun, he became the Silver Age flash foe, Captain Cold.
He is another one of our classic villain geniuses. He's brilliant, he's imaginative, but he only thinks for himself.
Since the Flash was the first of the heroes revived, Every time someone new got added to his rogues gallery, it was cool because finally people were creating villains worthy of a hero.
You know, I'm going to my most primal childhood memories of these characters. He carried a gun, and like any bad guy who carried a gun was kind of cool.
Captain Cold fits into the world of the gimmick villains. Flash was great with those, and as a kid I loved them because they were so fun.
Captain Cold's got one of the great costumes. Not a unique power. There are a half dozen other guys out there who have the same ice power. Killer Frost and the Icicle and Mr. Freeze, and God knows some of the others, but I always loved the outfit, and I love the fact that he was there before many of the others.
A wealthy socialite with a screw loose, the Cheetah has battled Wonder Woman for over 60 years. She is one of the 2 female members of the nefarious Legion of Doom.
The cheetah was a mythic animal, even in ancient Greece, prized for the villa. It was a prized animal for the wealthy, the aristocrats. So the association of the cheetah with riches and wealth and unseemly power goes back a few millennia.
Cheetah was a woman who was genetically engineered to be crossed with a cat.
There have been points in which she both had like some sort of jungle powers and times in which she didn't. There were times when she was almost possessed by the spirit of a cheetah and could even transform into a beast.
The cheetah keeps getting reinvented. During Justice, Alex did a version of the cheetah where it was a woman wearing essentially a cheetah skin costume. Not a cheetah-like print, but you could see the seams where she had taken the poor creature and sewed it together to make a costume for herself. That was creepy. That's the version I think I like the most.
Empowered with vast psychic abilities, Gorilla Grodd is a power-hungry exile from the secret society of Gorilla City.
He is Gorilla Grodd, who comes from essentially utopia, and he's not happy.
He knows what it's like to have been in paradise. And what's interesting is he speaks to the human problem of not being satisfied. Because he was in paradise and it wasn't enough for him.
Oh, I love Gorilla Grodd. He feels like he deserves to be ruling the world and that these hairless apes just have no place in it. And so he's going to use his powers to take over the world.
Imagine your worst fears brought to life before your eyes. Such is the power of the Scarecrow, who uses fear gas to cause terrifying hallucinations and seek revenge on a mocking world.
What I love about the Scarecrow is he's this guy who was picked on, who was made to fear other people, and he came up with a way to make other people afraid.
A character who can affect you on an emotional scale, you can't fight that intellectually. So to me, that's a great villain for Batman because Batman is all intellect.
Now you've got a villain whose whole shtick is fear. Here's Batman, who modus operandi is to make people afraid of him, facing a villain who's got the chemical power to make you afraid of anything he wants. And I think that's an interesting counterbalance for 2 characters.
Within the Hall of Doom stands a villain who was once a hero. The story of Sinestro is a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of absolute power.
Sinestro is always fun because he's kind of a negative version of Green Lantern.
Just as Green Lantern uses a mighty power ring that wields green energy, Sinestro uses his yellow power ring that is the only color which Green Lantern's power cannot affect.
Sinestro, interesting villain, very similar to Gorilla Grodd in that he's part of an entire police force and goes bad.
He was probably the greatest Green Lantern of them all until Hal Jordan became the greatest Green Lantern of them all.
You got a guy like Sinestro who was a good guy. He became like the king of a planet, and then the power went to his head and he went mad.
He became what Dr. Doom is, what the Red Skull is. He became a person who said, the world would be better if I ran it.
For a hero, death and rebirth can be a transformative experience. But for the supervillain Solomon Grundy, death and rebirth have failed to quench his mindless pursuit of violence.
I remember as a kid getting a comic book, and Solomon Grundy was this big, massive white dude with ripped clothing, with white hair, that would literally punch Superman, and Superman would go flying for 10 miles.
Solomon Grundy had been a gangster who had been killed and thrown into a swamp outside of New Orleans, and rose again as this hulking, indestructible creature.
I think Solomon Grundy is a great name. I love the whole aspect of him being named for the nursery rhyme.
He's a villain that continues to die over and over again. And so he's trapped in the state. You know, maybe that speaks to another truth for villains. Maybe the tragedy of a villain is that he or she cannot change.
Though the Joker is not technically a member of the Legion of Doom, there is little doubt that this murderous madman is one of the most resilient and terrifying villains in the DC gallery.
The Joker is maybe the best trickster villain in all of literature.
In all mythologies, from ancient Greece with Hermes, to Ireland, to Native American mythology with the coyote character, there is a trickster figure. The trickster is the one who mocks seriousness, who mocks heroism. For centuries in old Europe, kings and queens actually had resident fools to come in to make sure that hubris wasn't overwhelming them. In the comic book world, you've got the Joker.
Joker was the best because he was just nuts. So he was about chaos, and Batman's universe was about order.
You don't have any idea what he's going to do. He might kill you because he doesn't like the color of your shoes, or he might give you $1,000, also because he doesn't like the color of your shoes.
I love the Joker because I'm convinced that he knows Batman is Bruce Wayne. And it just wouldn't be funny if he admitted it or told anybody.
He's a forerunner of Hannibal Lecter, another great trickster villain. He's just bonkers, and therefore fascinating.
The Legion of Doom's leader is none other than the brilliant supervillain Lex Luthor. For over 65 years, this evil genius has tormented Superman and the heroes of the DC universe.
Lex Luthor is so swollen with his own self-knowledge of himself being brilliant, gifted, wealthy, that he decides to use all of these powers, all of this talent, for one singular purpose, and that is to rid the world of Superman.
He's a self-made man. He's a success story.
Everything is going fine. He's the greatest citizen in Metropolis. And then Superman comes to town and nobody looks at him. They all look up to the skies. And there's that sudden personal thing where, my God, you stole my thunder.
He hates that Superman's out there because he's done everything a regular human can do to be super.
It shows you what happens if you can't assimilate your own dark side.
In many ways, Lex Luthor is a Salieri. He's the man who doesn't have the talent of the others, but who is in a position of tremendous power, but who resents the fact that anyone else has talent, and it drives him nuts. And that's what makes him a villain.
I love Superman. I completely trust Superman, but I have to acknowledge that it would be foolish of us not to be a little wary of a man who can see through walls and hear any conversation in a socio-political climate where there's cameras on every street corner and where there's wiretapping going on all over the place. It's kind of hypocritical of me to morally sanction one and be skeptical of the other.
This is the wolf in sheep's clothing motif for the villain, that you act like you're going to bring peace and prosperity, riches and health, all the rewards if you just trust me.
Lex Luthor, who was kind of the narrator at the beginning of Justice, his whole thing was that humanity cannot solve its own problems because there are superheroes present who can save them from them.
Luthor's ultimate upper hand came in 2000 when he decided, you know what, this world would be better if I were president of the United States, and declared his candidacy. His public persona was such that he won, and Superman didn't do anything to stop it because it never occurred to Superman that the American people didn't know what he knew. It didn't occur to him that they would ever vote for Luthor. So we got 4 years of the world's greatest supervillain in the White House. You know, draw your own allegories here.
For a brief time in Superman's career, Luthor donned a supervillain suit, and that's the one that we had gotten rid of. I felt that Luthor's strength was his brain. Superman is smart, but he's never had to be a genius. So the trick with Luthor was all of his crimes were so well conceived and so well hidden, Superman could never prove Luthor was a villain. He could never go out and say, arrest him. So they don't have a match in powers. They're exact opposites, in fact, because Superman could go poink and Luthor's dead. But what they are matches in terms of brain versus brawn.
If one supervillain was bad news, the specter of a collection of fiendish foes working together was, on its face, a frightening proposition. But with evil tendencies come complications.
The biggest difference between the Legion of Doom and the comic books, and I think the Legion of Doom on the old Super Friends series, is the level of doomishness they've got. And certainly in Justice, they're nasty, some guns. I mean, they're planning to take over the world, they're planning to devastate everybody. They are Doom. If they succeed, much of the world is doomed. If the Super Friends version, you know, maybe there would be a traffic jam.
In our Justice League, we got a group of villains together in one story where they were Luthor organized them and got them together, and they were going to challenge the Justice League. And they captured Batman at first, and it looked like they were going to do really well for themselves. But ultimately, all of their internal character flaws got the better of them.
One of the big things that I thought about in Justice was, how could you have a community of villains? Because the very nature of what these characters are intrinsically self-oriented approaches to ordering the world.
At heart, Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman all want the same thing. You put Luthor and Brainiac and Joker in the same room, and, you know, beyond eradication of the superheroes, they don't really want the same thing at all. They want it all for themselves. Selfishness is generally the key ingredient that always undoes the supervillain groups.
Reflecting the turbulence of the late 1960s, comic book writers of the Bronze Age balked at the status quo for villainy. They began to search for ways to give their villains a genuine sense of menace.
The writers got tired of telling those same toothless stories over and over again, and there's a famous Batman story called The Joker's Five-Way Revenge. After years of the Joker being essentially a clown who robbed banks and did pranks, this was the murdering Joker of the 40s again. This was a lethal, awful, hideous, disfigured clown of crime who went around on a murderous spree, and Batman had to leap into the fray. The success of that story and that vitality that the Joker suddenly had again gave all comics writers permission to ramp up the other villains.
Villains became not only more dangerous, but more emotionally complex, mirroring the ever-growing sophistication of their readers. Comic books began to delve deeper into the motivations of their villains.
If you look at the comics back in the 1940s, villain was very clear because he'd point to a chest and say, I'm a villain, I'm going to do evil, I'm going to take over the world. As villains evolved, though, and their goals became a little more gray, I think that opened the opportunity to show more depth and understanding. Two-Face was cured a couple of times. His face was healed surgically, but his soul was never healed. You thought it was just a scarred face, but actually it was a much deeper problem within him. The scarred face was very easy to understand in the 40s and 50s. We had to go much deeper once we get into the 70s, 80s, into the 90s, in today's comics.
It has to be richer because the readers are older, and they're going to demand something that now appeals to a 20-year-old, not to an 8-year-old. And that's good for the industry because you still have comics for 8-year-olds, but now you have comics for 20-year-olds.
Not only had the average reader of comic books matured, but the brutal history of the 20th century brought to light a knowledge of evil previously unimaginable. And it was often an evil that seemed benevolent at first blush. Comic book writers and artists felt compelled to bring this darker, more sophisticated vision of evil to their work.
You look at Pol Pot in Cambodia, Mao in China, Stalin and Hitler, and all these demonic characters. They began not villainously, not recognizably, but heroically. With every generation, it seems, comic books have become more vigilant about the promises of politicians. What you see happening in the beginning of so many stories is that a spell is cast. The whole world becomes enchanted, as it were. And the common folks are hypnotized by these promises. And it takes a hero to be able to see through the emptiness of those promises.
When you get into the modern age, we tend to have villains with bigger powers. We tend to have villains that have more complex personalities and agendas. Characters like Ra's al Ghul from Batman, who is basically saying that mankind is destroying the Earth. Therefore, we need to destroy mankind so that Earth can be saved. He's like the ultimate ecological terrorist.
Thinking about some of the DC villains, there are books where they've spent a lot of time doing a great job developing villains. Like The Flash is an example that comes to mind. Jeff Johns spent like a whole year just building up the Flash's rogues gallery. And these characters that were sort of jokes prior, they become so much more in depth, and you really believe they can take down the Flash now.
I think the beauty of comic book storytelling is that villainy comes in many forms. In something like Identity Crisis, the villain ends up being a jilted lover. It's Ray Palmer's ex-wife. We look at some of the Batman stories like Long Halloween, Dark Victory. The villain is never quite whom you think it is.
As villains became more ambiguous, heroes followed suit. Their motivations tinged with darkness. Heroes' methods were often harsh, even brutal.
Particularly after Watergate, after Nixon. It's been very hard to believe in pristine heroes.
An all good, all radiating hero is also a boring hero. The exciting one is the one who's conquering the evil or the badness, the shadow in his own heart.
It's easy for me to sit here and go, Superman never kills, Batman never kills. That's an easy thing to say, but it's not a very good story. It's a much better story if you actually show Superman coming to the edge and having to make that decision and show me why he can't cross that line.
As the line between villains and heroes blurred, comic books began to ask the question, are good and evil absolute, or are they open to interpretation? The topic was explored in the JLA storyline, The Obsidian Age.
We had these characters called the Ancients, and they were basically an ancient Justice League. We had a character called Tezumak, who was basically an Aztec war engineer, and he had a suit of armor that ran on human sacrifice. So whenever he would talk about it, the people who were being sacrificed were honored, and it was a great privilege for them to serve this god. And he didn't have any moral compunctions about, like, well, the blood of children powers my armor. When our league sees those guys, they're considered inhuman monsters. It's just like, how could they possibly think this is okay? But it was set, 1,500 years or so in the past. So obviously everything about our societies were different.
Comic book creators in the 21st century continue to blur the line between heroism and villainy. Writers like Brad Meltzer ask the difficult questions about the nature of punishment and the perception of good and evil.
What happens in Identity Crisis is the Justice League had actually magically lobotomized some villains who they felt were just too dangerous to be left walking around. And not only had they done it to some of the villains, but they had done it to some of their colleagues as well in order to erase their memories of those events, which had obviously crossed some moral lines.
Now, is it heroic when they do it to the villains? What happens when they do it to the heroes? Does it stop being heroic? Same action, different response.
The big issue is, does anyone have the right to be judge, jury, and executioner? Even if the transgressions are so obviously evil and wrong, do you still have the right to act on your own?
We actually were doing Identity Crisis right around the time of the Republican and Democratic conventions. And if you look at politics, they all believe they're doing right. They all just go about it in different ways with different goals in mind. So we try to sort of bring some of that established ideals to our superheroes. Take that concept and then push it to the extreme.
Even as they surf the murky waters of moral ambiguity, today's comic book storytellers are mindful of the fundamental differences between heroes and villains.
A villain is someone who wants to be a hero. A hero is someone who doesn't want to be the hero, but has to be.
Villains are active, heroes are reactive. I think the biggest difference between a hero and a villain is that when the hero wins, the world and status quo maintain. The hero leaves things as he found it, maybe with some shattered buildings and some crushed street lamps. If the villain wins, you're living in a whole different world. The villain's now in charge of you. It's a dictatorship. You don't have free will. You know, nothing runs on time. You can't get cable anymore. It's a whole different planet.
You know, our heroes will use force, but they don't want to put the public in danger. A villain doesn't care who he puts in danger to achieve his goal.
A hero will try to save the day, including the life of the villain. A hero has to care for his enemy, and that's what makes them a hero.
When choosing his villain for the new frontier, writer and artist Darwin Cooke knew the menace had to be powerful enough to threaten the extinction of mankind itself.
When I sat down to try to figure out who that menace was, I noticed that in most of these stories, it's an alien comes from outer space. And I thought I'd rather go the other way. And I said, what if there was a creature that evolved independently and had been on our planet the entire time, since the birth of creation?
The center was Darwin's way of sort of tying together all the early DCU business with Dinosaur Island.
The creature kept the dinosaurs on itself, on the surface of its own body, for food.
So it wasn't until the center felt threatened by humanity developing weapons of mass destruction that it decided that it needed to rise up and destroy humanity to protect itself.
If you look at the DC Comics line around 1960, you saw in it reoccurring fascinations with outer space, with monsters, with alienation. And what Darwin took in all of that were the disparate elements to pull together into a single plot for New Frontier.
Darwin Cooke's massive supervillain challenged the heroes of the Silver Age in bold and imaginative ways. But like many of the story elements in the New Frontier, the center was more than it seemed.
Nobody's ever realized the broadest metaphor that the book carried, which is that the center is, of course, communism. It is a giant, faceless organism that absorbs the individual units to combine and create a whole. And I thought it was so obvious. Maybe that's why nobody's ever noticed it. I was kind of actually embarrassed of making such a literal metaphor out of it, but nobody's ever really picked up on it, so there you go.
From the Ice Age to the Space Age, villains have personified our fears and anxieties. Whether the evildoer is an alien menace created to fascinate young readers or a criminal mastermind bent on world domination, a villain's battle against a hero symbolizes the eternal struggle within each of us to turn away from temptation and walk the path of the righteous.